Today's lesson is lesson 2. It's on events of archaic Greece. If you remember, Egyptian history was divided into 3 historical periods called the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. Greek history is also divided into 3 historical periods. They're called the Archaic, the Classical, and the Hellenistic periods. And we're going to learn about each of those periods starting today with the Archaic period. So, today's schedule, we're going to finish up yesterday's notes with the question and summary sections, and then we're going to talk about the events of archaic Greece, and of course there's another Greek cartoon video. I'll post it on my website down below. So I can name 6 events from archaic Greece. We're going to focus on 6 events as we learn about the archaic period. Today's note-taking style is my favorite one. It's called pictures and captions. So as we learn about each of the major events, the assignment will be to draw a picture of it and then write a caption for it as well. You can see some of these examples from years past. Here are the 6 events we're going to be talking about. The first thing of the archaic period was back in the archaic period, that's kind of when the Greek language was developed. So on the left, we can see the Greek alphabet. Greek, like English, has uppercase and lowercase letters. Here is the Greek alphabet in the same order as the English alphabet, although that's not the order the letters go in Greek. But the first few letters are the same. As a matter of fact, we call this the alphabet. If you'll notice, the first 2 letters of the Greek alphabet are alpha and beta. So in Greek, saying alphabet, it's like saying, do you know your ABCs? Do you know your ABs? This is the Greek alphabet. As you continue through school, you will learn more and more of the Greek alphabet because a lot of these letters are used in mathematics and in science to represent all sorts of different concepts. So you'll learn more about the Greek alphabet. But it's neat that we can look at things carved into stone that are thousands of years old, and we can start to really recognize, hey, I know about half the letters on here because they look similar to a lot of the letters that we use in English today. So, in the earliest period of Greek history, the Archaic period, that's when the Greek language was developed. Another thing from back then, city-states. We already talked yesterday when we did the map that there were many, many different city-states, and because the geography was so hard, making it difficult to travel from city to city, the cities became quite independent, and that's why they're not just cities, it's a city-state. And here are some examples of city-states. So back then, the city-states were growing up and developing. The third event, the Olympics. Every few years, they would gather together and each city-state would send its best athletes to Olympia, a city-state just to the north and west of Sparta. And they would compete in athletic contests. And they didn't have as many events as we do in our modern Olympics, but the idea was that they would have peace and athletic competition. And even if the city-states were at war, they would stop temporarily when the Olympic Games were played. And each city-state would send their best athletes, and they would compete in the shield run and wrestling and throwing the discus and throwing the javelin and boxing and all sorts of other just kind of early, more primitive events. And the winners weren't awarded medals. They were awarded, the grass crown or the laurel wreath. It's like a crown that's made out of leaves, and it was a real honor to bring that back to your city-state to show that you had won some of these events. So, the first Olympic Games were actually held in ancient times, the earliest period of Greek history, the Archaic period. And they continued on in Greek history for some time. And then they stopped as the Greeks, went away and didn't have so much prominence in the world. They stopped playing the Olympic Games, and the Olympic Games were brought back only now in modern times. We still do the Olympics again now. And each year, every 4 years when the Olympic Games are played, they light the flame for the Olympic torch. That flame is lit in Olympia, and then it's carried by volunteers and athletes and representatives. That torch is hand-carried from place to place until it reaches the site that the Olympic Games are going to be played, whether that be in Atlanta or Los Angeles in the United States, or in London or in Beijing. Wherever the Olympics is being held, the flame will be carried by torch from Olympia, Greece, to that city location. Next, the fourth event, religion and myths. All the Greek religion and the Greek myths, their gods and goddesses, all came about, those belief systems, during the Archaic period. We'll learn a whole lot more about Greek religion and Greek myths over the next few weeks. Another event of the Archaic period was epic writing, particularly two famous epic poems. You'll remember that an epic, as we learned when we discussed the Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia, an epic is an action-adventure poem, and the two most famous are the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad tells the story of the Trojan War, the Greeks versus the Trojans, and how that all happened with the Trojan Horse and everything. And then the other famous epic poem is the Odyssey, which tells the exciting story of how one Greek general, Odysseus, struggled to find his way home to Greece from the Trojan War, a 10-year journey to get him home. Both of these poems are attributed to a Greek writer named Homer. We're not particularly sure if there was a real Homer, if Homer really was just one person, because these poems were told and these stories were recited and passed down for hundreds of years before they actually got written down. And we have the written forms of them now, and you'll probably have to read at least one of those books when you're in high school. And they are actually pretty exciting books. But we're not really sure if there was really a Homer who wrote these down, because it's just so long ago. It's just hard to know for certain. But we will learn much more about the Iliad and the Odyssey. The last event we're going to talk about is the Trojan War. Again, it was so long ago, we're not really sure if it actually happened or not. If it did happen, if the Greeks went to war with the Trojans, it would have been during this Archaic period. We think that Troy was kind of another up-and-coming non-Greek city-state that was just a little bit to the east of Greece, over in what's now modern-day Turkey. And because the Greeks and the Trojans were both kind of developing and expanding at that time, they may have come into conflict with each other because they were both competing over the same territories. And a war ensued. The Iliad tells us that the war happened because, the queen, the wife of one of the kings of Sparta, ran away and went to be with Paris, who was one of the princes in Troy, which of course angered the Greeks. And Helen, his wife Helen of Troy, was the face that launched 1,000 ships because the Greeks sailed to Troy and launched a war to bring her back. Of course, we don't know if any of that is true. We're not even 100% sure that the Trojan War happened. But if it did happen, it happened during this time. There are some interesting archaeological ruins of cities that would date from about that time in the Turkey area, but it's just hard to know whether or not it really happened. If it did, then it was during the Archaic period. This comes from the movie Troy, which tells the story of the Iliad and the famous Trojan Horse, right? The Greeks built the Trojan Horse so that they could penetrate the walls of Troy, which were so high that they couldn't get in, and the Trojans were able to resist the Greeks. So the smart general Odysseus came up with a plan to build a wooden horse sculpture, and then to make it seem as if all the Greeks had left and that the Trojans had won the war. The Trojans, fearing that they would dishonor the gods if they left the horse outside the gates, had to bring the horse into the city, and they had a big party, and everyone was having a good time. And then that night, when they all went to sleep, the Greeks, who had been hiding inside of the large horse sculpture, snuck out and opened the doors, allowing the rest of the Greek army who hadn't left, but who had just been in hiding, or who had left and turned around and come back, allow them to enter the city, and the Greeks won the war and destroyed the city. Again, how much of this is story, how much of it actually happened, we're not sure. But whatever parts of it did really happen, it was during the Archaic period of Greek history. Thanks!